Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is Tyler. If you are new here, welcome. If you're not, welcome back. Today I'm going to talk about two women who were murdered in the year 1963. The story is going to cover some racism, or at least I'm going to point out the racism. So with everything going on in the world, I wanted to find a way to contribute to bringing awareness and, discussing about, racism. Oh my God, wow. Good job, Tyler. Good job. Racism does play a huge role in this story, and I'm going to talk about it. I think with everything going on in the world right now, Black Lives Matter, the death of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and many more lives that have been taken, and the injustice that is yet still to be put in motion is just, it leaves me baffled, it leaves me breathless. I think it is definitely something that we should be talking about and that we should bring awareness to, and I have yet to do that because I've been trying to find a way to do it without just like making a post on social media. I kind of wanted to do this story not only because it intrigued me, but because of the racism that's very present in it. And I wanted to share it with you. I wanted to bring it to your attention. I wanted to spread awareness in some corner of the internet in some way that I'm familiar with, if that makes sense. Like, since I do these videos, I thought, you know what, let's find something that could kind of relate and show people like racism isn't a joke. And it's been going on for years and many years, like before this day and time, before today. So I came across this story and I not only thought it was interesting, but I thought, wow, there's a lot of injustice that was done in this story. And even though it has a happy ending and people are brought to justice, I still want to share it. So with that being said, I wanted to let you know that in the description box down below, I'm going to be providing links that you can use to educate yourself. You can visit these websites to support them, to donate to them, to volunteer for them. And they are all consistent, with everything that's going on today. They are working towards making a better tomorrow, a better future for Black lives. So if you're interested in doing that, please check the description box down below. I highly recommend that you do, and just take a look. I have one article that suggests 153 organizations, charities, and such, and I also have some individual links down there of organizations and charities that I personally thought were really cool and very beneficial to making better change in this world towards Black people and just obliterating racism altogether. So please take a moment to check that out. I really appreciate it. Warning: before we move on, I need to put out why do I always blank on this? Viewer discretion. Viewer discretion is advised, okay? There are going to be descriptions of blood, sexual assault, physical wounds, and the gruesome physical trauma done onto the victims. So before you move on with this video, if you are sensitive to those kinds of things, I recommend that you tread lightly and with caution, and that you have been warned. And hey, if you want to click off this video, if it's too much for you, I totally understand. I will be here next week. All good. Okay, and if you can see it, I don't know if you can. If you can see just like a really messed up corner right here, like with my eyelashes and my makeup, please ignore it. It's driving me crazy, but my tear ducts end up just making this eye in particular cry every time I do my eye makeup because it's that sensitive and it pisses me off, but please just ignore the mess, okay? Like, I just want to move forward with that. I don't want to see anybody coming at me in the comments. I've done makeup for years. This eye is still a piece of shit. So let's just go on. Since there isn't many events leading up to the murder of these two individuals, I'm going to go ahead and start off with a description of the people that play a role in this murder case, and then I'm going to go ahead and go into the murder itself. Patricia Towles was 23 years old. There isn't much information on her except for the fact that she had a very driven passion to become a reporter and researcher for Newsweek. It was this company that she worked for at the time in 1963, and I almost forgot to mention this story does take place in New York City. Patricia Tolles later on remained with Newsweek in her life and became a reporter for Time Life. Like, that was just her passion. She wanted to be a part of it. She worked specifically for Midtown headquarters of Newsweek with her roommate, Janice Wylie. Now, Janice Wylie was 21 years old. She was, you know, like Patricia, she worked at Newsweek, but her main passion in life was to become an actress. And she took, you know, acting classes at her local neighborhood playhouse. She was an aspiring actress, you know, for Hollywood, whether it be on Broadway. She just wanted to be a part of that lifestyle and that industry. So she worked really hard on, you know, practicing, taking classes, working up to that. Her father, actually, she comes from a life of like power and privilege in New York City in the 60s. In the 60s, her father was actually Max Melville Wiley, and he was known around New York City as a writer, novelist, radio host, and radio advertiser. He was a very big up-and-coming figure in New York, and he was very, very well established in the 60s. In fact, he was the co-creator of a TV show called The Flying Nun, which was a very big hit around that time, and it starred Sally Fields. Now, if you don't know who Sally Fields is, Sally Fields, like, one movie I know that she's from is Mrs. Doubtfire with actor and comedian Robin Williams. Sally Fields played his wife and the mother of his children. She was actually like a very prominent character within that movie. And if you don't know what Mrs. Doubtfire is, we can't be friends. Okay, I don't know who, but somebody's done a disservice to you. I just gotta let you know. You gotta find that person. You gotta tell them, listen, what is Mrs. Doubtfire? I need to know. And they better hook you up. All right, sorry, getting distracted. Anyway, so as you can understand, she comes from a very long line of talent. And because her father was successful, she had a lot of money. She was very wealthy growing up. And she, you know, ended up getting an apartment with Patricia herself and their third roommate, Emily Hoffert. Emily Hoffert was 23 years of age when she had moved from Edina, I'm sorry if I'm saying this wrong, Edina, Minneapolis, to New York City. Her family was originally from Minneapolis, and there isn't much information regarding Emily, except for the fact that she came from a well-off family in Minneapolis where her father was said to be a very popular and prominent physician. She had an older sister named Mary, and the both of them were adopted. Emily had moved to New York for just that summer before she would officially start teaching there. She was known to be a very intelligent, bright, yet short, very shy brunette who mostly kept to herself. She was good friends with Patricia and Janice, but beyond them, she wasn't very social with anybody. It had a lot to do with her being to New York and, you know, just moving from Minneapolis. She didn't have very many friends. She wasn't very social, so she didn't have, like, a very, like, social gathering. Also, she was a very big bookworm. She was very heavily into her academics, very focused on getting her degrees from Smith College in New York. So, you know, safe to say, like, she put friends and, like, being social last on her list of priorities, which, I mean, hey, I ain't judging. That's how it should be to an extent. Make sure you still have some friends, you know, in the mix. It's good. Janice Wylie was a very classic party gal. She was very outgoing, ambitious, friendly to everybody that crossed paths with her. She was also known to be very flirtatious with men, whether they be from work, outside of work. She was known to pick some up at local pubs or bars, bring them back to the apartment, get to know them to an extent. And yeah, she was very lively, and she was described to be a party animal and a very bubbly, outgoing girl. So that's not what we know about these women, and all three of these women shared a single apartment on East 88th Street in New York City. This location was like a very wealthy, lavish area that was known to hold very wealthy white families, and the reason I have to label that is because later on it'll make a little more sense. So they all moved in together. They lived Emily lived with Janice and Patricia for a short time before she decided that it was time for her to move on and get an apartment of her own. So, you know, closer and on the murder that took place, Emily is like, you know, getting ready to leave. She's running errands, and I think, like, you know, within the time frame of this happening, it'll probably be like another, you know, few days and she'll be like moving out. Just like give you guys like a mental image. And this brings us to the day it all happened. On August 26, 1963, Patricia left for work very early, around 9 a.m., while Emily had left around the same time. Emily was going out to run errands because she was moving. There was like a few things she needed to do before she officialized that, and so she had left around the same time that Patricia had, and Janice Wylie was the last one to be in the apartment. Janice had switched shifts with one of her colleagues, and so instead of going in early on in the day, she was scheduled at 11 a.m. On that same day, later on, Janice Wylie had not shown up for her shift. She was a no-show. Her colleagues were obviously upset at her because, you know, they're like, what the heck, we switched shifts so you could come in later, so you could make it on time. You know, however, Janice Wylie, this wasn't her passion, so it wasn't unheard of for her to be unreliable and not show up to work on time. But they did still ask an assistant to reach out to Janice Wylie since she had not called in sick or reached out to anybody or notified them. So an assistant was asked to call the apartment. An assistant had called the apartment like a couple of times, and the phone calls were left unanswered. When they were left unanswered, they had then contacted Janice Wylie's mother. Janice Wylie's mother, Miss Wylie, had picked up the phone and she was baffled. She didn't know where her daughter was, and so she ended up giving the assistant Patricia Toll's work number. The assistant hung up with Miss Wylie, called Patricia at work, who picked up the phone, and she too did not know where Janice was. But she did inform the assistant like this was common. It wasn't uncommon for Janice not to follow up or be responsible and call work and be like, hey, I'm sick, or I missed my alarm, I'm late, or I'm not coming in. So Patricia ended up, you know, telling the assistant, like, you know what, I think my roommate Emily is out to lunch with her friend Susan Rothberg. Let me give her a call and see if she knows anything about Janice. Patricia hangs up with the assistant, calls Susan Rothberg, who actually tells Patricia Emily is a no-show. I don't know where she is. I haven't seen her. I'm still waiting to see if she'll show up. So Patricia tells Susan, okay, you know, if she ends up coming and, you know, could you ask her if she knows anything about Janice and give me a call back? Thank you. Susan's like, yeah, sure, no problem. And they hang up. So it's a lot of like telephone just to like see where Janice is out at, like why she isn't answering the phone, why she didn't show up to work, where is she? But after going through like, how many people is that? After calling the apartment, Jim, Miss Wylie, Patricia, and Susan, after going through like 4 people, they finally were like, you know what? She's not answering. Nobody knows where she is. It's fine. We'll just mark her down as like sick today. Like, you know, she didn't give us a call. It's fine. We'll just assume like she's sick and forgot to call us, you know, what have you. I almost forgot to mention, the reason like Patricia thought to call Susan Rothberg, Emily's friend, was because they were actually scheduled to have like a lunch date that day or like a brunch date. And so Patricia was like, oh, you know, this is about the time that they're meeting up and eating. So let me call Susan. And then that's when she called her and said, Emily actually didn't show up. I'm still waiting for her. Almost forgot to mention that. You're welcome. Just a reminder, since Janice was unreliable and that this wasn't uncommon for her to like skip work without like showing up or like giving a heads up, nobody really thought anything of it. Later that afternoon, Patricia had returned home from work around 6:25 p.m. So this was later in the afternoon, and she, you know, took the subway home. She walked up to the apartment building, took the elevator to the 3rd floor, and walked over to her apartment 3C. She unlocked the door and walked into the apartment. And, you know, as she was, like, getting inside, she's probably, like, talking out loud, like, seeing if anybody's there at home. And, you know, it's pretty late. You know, at this point, she knows, like, one or both of her roommates would be home. Maybe she would see them walking around, using the bathroom, in their bedrooms. But nobody was there. So as she's walking in, she's like, oh, you know, Janice, like, why didn't you show up to work? Nobody answers. In the main hallway from the entrance, she sees across the apartment that the kitchen service door is open and, you know, this kind of like gets her a little uneasy because this morning she had bolted that door. If you guys don't know what a kitchen service door, it's okay. I actually had to look it up because I didn't know what that was. Like, y'all are probably like, stupid ass, but like I really didn't know what that was. So I looked that up in a kitchen service store for those of you like me who didn't know what that was. In mainly like New York apartments or maybe very small apartments, there's this kitchen service store and it's a door within the kitchen. Sorry. But it's mainly used as a fire escape or a means of like an emergency exit if something happens in the apartment. And sometimes in some cases it'll lead you back to the front entrance of your apartment. So, or like to the very bottom entrance of the apartment building. So like, you know, Patricia sees this and she's kind of like, well, that's weird. I bolted that this morning. I know I did, and yet it's open. So now she's kind of just like, all right, that's a little weird. So she starts walking into the apartment, and on the side of the central hallway, you know, to her right, there are 2 bedrooms. The first one is Emily's bedroom, which has twin beds, and she has that to herself. The next bedroom is Janice and Patricia's bedroom, and that has twin beds as well, which they each have their own. When she looks into Emily's bedroom, she sees that all of her items and like belongings are just dumped on the floor. Her room is trashed. It looks like somebody like rummaged through her things and it's completely destroyed. Like her books, clothing, papers, her letters. So it said, I'm sorry, I have to read my notes for this. So it said there were 2 suitcases placed on one of the twin beds by the door to the bedroom. They were opened and the contents within them were also thrown to the side as if someone had rummaged through them. There were no sheets on the twin bed by the bedroom window, and Emily's dresser had all of its drawers pulled open. The contents within the dresser were dumped on the floor, such as coins, cigarette packs, hair curlers, and so on. So at this point, Patricia was beginning to feel frightened because she's like kind of like a no-brainer. Like, I don't think Emily was in that big of a rush to where she needed to trash her own room. Like, trust me, we all have those days where like we're missing an item and we have to like disorganize our entire room to find it. But like this had looked like a tornado went through it. Like she had described the bedroom as like completely unrecognizable. So, you know, after this, she doesn't even go to like investigate Janice's bedroom. Like she doesn't even get past Emily's bedroom. Instead, her attention is taken to the bathroom across the hall, which was dubbed Emily's bathroom. So the reason she went to the bathroom is because she saw that the door was ajar and the light was on. So usually you can assume that like when everybody leaves, they turn things off, they maybe close the doors. But the bathroom door was open and the light was on. So Patricia's like, okay, maybe somebody's here. Maybe they just didn't hear me. So she slowly starts creeping to the bathroom. And when she opens the door, the first thing that grabs her attention is a 12-inch wooden handle carving or kitchen blade on the ledge of the bathroom sink. Now, usually maybe she'd be like, this is weird, but okay. But what really set her into a panic was the fact that this knife had traces of blood on it, on the blade, and a bit in the sink. After seeing this, Patricia went into a full state of panic. She ran to the apartment house phone. She dialed her boyfriend. She said, look, something's wrong. Can you please come here? He said, yeah, I'll be there in as fast as I can. She hung up with him, called the 23rd Precinct Police, dialed them, said, look, I think somebody broke into my apartment. I found a bloody knife in my roommate's bathroom. I need somebody over here right away. They said, no problem. We're going to send the police over there. They should be very soon. She hung up with them, and then she called Mr. and Mrs. Wylie. So when Patricia was on the phone with Janice Wylie's parents, she had explained to them what she saw, and she said, you know, something's wrong. You know, can you please come here? And they were like, yeah, we'll be there as soon as possible. Now, Mr. and Mrs. Wylie had only lived like 2 blocks from the apartment, and they were the first ones to arrive out of the people that Patricia had called. Before they got there, Patricia like hung up the phone. She like ran out of the apartment building, like literally all the way to the entrance. And then she was getting antsy. She's like, maybe I should go back there. I don't know what to do. You know, so she ran back into the apartment building, waited in the main hallway outside of her apartment door. And when the Wileys got there, they found a very hysterical, very shooken up Patricia in the hallway. Of course, when the Wileys got there, they asked Patricia what had happened before entering the apartment, and she explained to them that when she had gotten there, the kitchen service door was open, Emily's room was trashed, and in her bathroom was a large knife with blood on it that was from their kitchen. You know, Mr. Wylie had asked both women to wait in the hallway while he went inside the apartment to further investigate, because since Patricia didn't mention like any sign of her roommates, he believed that there was like a good chance they could be in there. Like, they don't know what happened, but they're probably thinking like, okay, they're hiding in there from the assailant. Maybe they didn't know that that was Patricia or something like that. So he goes inside and he asks the women to wait in the hallway. As he goes into the apartment, he sees what Patricia had described to him. He saw Emily's torn up bedroom. He saw the bathroom light was on. He saw the knife in there. He then slowly goes to Janice and Patricia's bedroom to further investigate, because Patricia had said she didn't go in there because she was too frightened after what she had seen. Totally understandable. So he goes into the bedroom, and when he gets in there, the room is pretty much matchable to Emily's bedroom. It's trashed. All the contents are thrown around. Furniture is moved. It's crooked. It's out of place. It's disorganized. There's a corner in the room where one of the mattresses is kind of close and huddled to the bedroom wall. And as Mr. Wylie walks around this bedroom, this mattress, this bed, to see the other side against the wall, he there finds Janice Wylie and Emily Hoffert laying on the ground, dead. After that, Mr. Wylie walked back out of the apartment into the hallway, and he broke the sad news to both Miss Wylie and Patricia that the two women were indeed inside of the apartment, dead. Shortly after, the police were there on the scene. They were taking photos. Forensics was sweeping the entire apartment, and detectives were asking the Wileys and Patricia questions regarding the girls and what had happened. Both Janice Wylie and Emily Hoffert were found between the mattress and the bedroom wall. It was said that Janice was nude and she was laying face upward towards the ceiling. She was bound tightly by her ankles with white cloth, including her wrists. Her face, neck, and thighs were covered in dried blood as she was disemboweled. Her intestines laid outside of her stomach across her abdomen. She had several stab wounds on the chest that had punctured her heart, and there was an estimate that she had been stabbed 7 times in the chest. There was Noxzema skin lotion found on Janice's body and on her genitalia. It was determined that Janice had been sexually assaulted and that her attacker had used the skin cream as a lubricant. They did find samples of semen on her body, but back then they did not have that kind of technology to use towards finding the suspect, because their technology wasn't that advanced, so there was like really no existing records for that kind of thing. Emily laid right beside Janice, facing Janice in a sideways position, and she was clothed. She wore a green skirt, and she was also bound by the wrists and ankles by a white cloth. Her upper garments were blood-soaked, as her jugular had been slit from end to end. So she had blood all over her neck, all over her chest, and her head. There were cuts on Emily's wrists and palms that indicated she had attempted to fight back against her attacker, who had come at her with the knife. Both women were not only tightly bound by the wrists and the ankles with white cloth, but they were also bound together by the forearms and the wrists with a blue-green bedspread. Now, as for the crime scene that took place in Janice's and Patricia's bedroom, the police had documented, and I have to read my notes for this, the police had documented that a radiator near the bodies had 2 large carving knives placed on top of it. Both blades were snapped off, and each had blood on the handles. On the floor across from the radiator, one of the knife blade tips were found. There was an open jar of Noxzema skin cream, the lid of the jar a few feet away. Amongst the room, they found a Pepsi bottle broken at the neck, a sanitary napkin, a pair of black underpants, a green bedspread, and blood-soaked bedsheet strips. Emily's blood-smeared glasses, then the second knife blade piece that belonged to the second knife found on the radiator. They found glass slivers in the room from the broken bottle. Later on, it is said that the women, they suffered from head trauma and the stabbing wounds. It was believed that the attacker had used this Coke bottle to hit them over the head to knock them out or subdue them in a sense. The last thing that they found notable at the crime scene was a radio clock that was disconnected and stopped at the time of 10:37 a.m. that day on August 26, 1963. Once an ambulance had arrived, it took 4 men to grab the bodies and load them into the ambulance before they were driven to the morgue. Max Wylie had taken the time to call Emily Hoffert's parents in Minneapolis, and break the sad and unfortunate news to them that their daughter had passed away. After observing the crime scene, it was apparent to detectives that the primary target here was Janice Wylie, and they described Emily Hoffert as a secondary casualty. Police believe that because of the stabbing, there's always like an emotional connection behind stabbing somebody. There's got to be a real driven emotion behind wanting to hurt somebody and stab them so violently, especially to the point where the blades break, right? So they're starting to think that this was a personal attack because there's got to be a lot of anger behind stabbing somebody and a lot of anger fueling that motion, especially to the point where you break not one, but 2 blades, 2 knives. And not only that, there was no sign of forced entry on the apartment. And then, so they're like, okay, they must know the attacker, because if there's no sign of forced entry, then they must have just let them in because they trust them, right? And besides that, Janice Wylie was naked, she was sexually assaulted, she was stabbed 7 times, and she was disemboweled. That alone kind of shows a lot more like hate and anger or connection with her, or focus, versus Emily, who was still clothed and given, in a sense, a quick death, and not very much attention was given to her by the attacker. So detectives decided, you know what, I think Janice Wylie was the main target here, and we should focus on her and investigate her and the people around her in her life. Within the next day, the media had already gotten word of these murders, and it hit the newspapers about the death of Janice Wylie and Emily Hoffert, who the media dubbed as the career girls. This is what the media gave the name of the murders and these 2 women, because in the 60s, this was a time that women weren't believed to be ambitious or have careers for themselves or work towards something for themselves. They were stay at home, do as husband says, bear children, cook, clean, and all that sort of stuff. So it was kind of like a mimicking thing, like, oh, the career girls, like, oh, these women have dreams. That's so funny. So they gave them the name the career girls. And as this hit the city, as the story of these 2 women being brutally slain in their apartment during their most prime time in their lives, New York was pretty shooken up about it, especially the neighborhood in the area that they lived in, where it's so nice and fancy and all these rich people live here, and the crime rates are supposed to be low and nothing bad like this is supposed to happen. Of course, this was very 60s mindset. It doesn't matter where you live, anything bad could happen. Let me just put it that way. But they were shooken up about it. They're like, this shouldn't be happening. I can't believe this. And especially back then, before more horrendous crimes took place in America or anywhere around the world, this was a pretty big murder. This girl was sexually assaulted. She was stabbed brutally. She was disemboweled, and this other girl had her throat slit. This was a pretty big deal. So the media and the public were already putting pressure on detectives to solve this. Who did this? Who was responsible? Because people were not very comfortable with uncertainty, basically. Police had a lot of detectives come from Manhattan, Brooklyn, all over New York. They had different cities, different towns of detectives and police coming in to help them solve this. There was that much immense pressure and basically the clock ticking for them to figure this out. Again, because of the media and the public, they wanted to know, and so police ended up just rushing through it more than just actually doing their job and investigating, at least some of them. And a lot of them were doing it because they were like, ooh, I want to get the bragging rights, I want to solve this, I want to be the big man, I want to be the top dog who figured this out, So there was a lot of that in play, a lot of ego, a lot of pride. So from the start, this case was just not, it was not getting off on the right foot. It got off on the wrong foot. So, since they were rushing to solve this, they were basically like not looking at the bigger picture. Police started with Janice Wiley's little green address book that they had found in her bedroom. Within that address book, they found many names, many associates, many ex-lovers, ex-flames, friends, guy friends, all sorts of things, everything in between. They ended up interviewing these people one by one. They, would look into their backgrounds, they would question them. In the end, everybody within that address book had no leads. It fizzled out very quickly. They didn't find anything from those individuals. Nobody had vendettas against her. Nobody had unreciprocated romantic interests in her. Nobody seemed like they wanted to hurt her. So that quickly ruled out. The next thing that they did to help themselves with the case was do basically a comb through of the neighborhood apartments. So any of the apartments that were near the girls' apartments and, within that vicinity, they ended up going literally door to door with their partners, like 2 detectives, in each apartment building. They were going door to door, questioning each tenant, going through hundreds of tenants, just asking them if they had heard anything, if they had seen anything that day. If they did, they documented it, they wrote it down, they questioned them, they look into their backgrounds. They even would target specifically people who had history of burglary. They were being arrested for possession of drugs. They had a history of sexual crimes against women, basically women haters. They were looking for anything that would target females. And they ended up questioning maybe 40 to 50 people with that kind of background, or who dabbled in that or was associated with that, but still no leads. They were getting nothing from doing that. Now, this comb through brings me to introduce one of our very most unliked characters in this murder case story. Enter from the Brooklyn North Division of Detectives, Eddie Bolger. Eddie Bolger was known to be, they called him Strong Arm Eddie, and they said that he was known to be a very stern, forward, brutal man. I don't believe in the physical sense, maybe just a little bit, but mostly the way he would talk to people. He was unprofessional, and in comparison to his partners or his associates, they were very calm, collective, professional, but he did not play by the rules. Okay, and that will make more sense and add up a little later into the story, but for now, let's just get into him. He was on the case for a short time because when he was doing this comb through in the apartments, it was apparent that he was racist. Yeah. He would tell DAs and head leaders of this case and detectives who were very prominent, oh yeah, I can always tell when black people are lying. And they'd be like, what? Yeah, I can always tell when black people are lying. You want to know how they're lying? How? How, Eddie? How? Because I can always see when their stomachs are turning. If you look at their stomach and it moves in and out, that means they're lying. Literally, I'm not kidding. Where's the exact quote? Oh yeah, you can always tell when a N-word is lying. I'm not going to say it. You watch his stomach. If it moves in and out, he's lying. I mean, first of all, thank God detectives were reported him and they kicked him off the case because they didn't want that sort of negative racism tainting the investigation, but also because they were what the fuck? I'm sorry. This guy was stupid and racist. You mean when their stomach moves in and out? You mean the, natural reflex of breathing when you inhale and exhale? You dumb motherfucker? Seriously? I'm sorry. That's straight up racist, but you're straight up stupid. How big is your IQ, bro? Literally. He would say that. If their stomach moves in and out, they're lying. I can tell when they're lying because if their stomach moves in and out, they're lying. And it's you mean when you're breathing? Why else does your stomach move in and out? Just think of it that way. Exactly. Okay. It's just I'm so done with this guy, from the beginning to the end. And you'll see why. It gets worse. So they kicked him off of the case because they're yeah, we don't need that around here. We're just trying to find out who murdered these people. We don't need you, giving us a bad reputation. That's how you may do it in Brooklyn, but in Manhattan, yeah, no. I feel the Manhattan police Some of them, sure, racist, but majority of them were like, Black Lives Matter, bitch, you know? So, like, they're like, yeah, you can get the fuck out. Like, take this guy back. We're good. Anyways, a couple months have passed, and detectives and police at this point, like, stressed every single lead that they may have had or think they had. Like, the apartment combing through didn't work, the address book didn't work, they questioned family, they questioned friends, they asked if they knew anybody that would want to hurt her, nothing turned up. So police began to get desperate, really. They ended up drying up any leads that they used to have, and it got to the point where a great editor of Newsweek had put out a reward for $10,000 for anybody that had any information regarding the murders, or anybody that would turn the guy in. And back then, $10,000 was like a lot of money. Today, that's worth maybe $100,000, possibly more. So as this reward was posted, you know, and there was a tip line established, a lot of people like tried to basically, instead of helping out, they tainted the investigation by giving like false information that led to nowhere, wasting detectives' time looking elsewhere instead of where they could possibly be looking for potential leads. So it was a big ass mess, okay? It wasn't until one day there was a patrolman who was doing his nightly rounds named Frank Isolda. Frank Isolda was just like a policeman who was like doing, you know, his nightly rounds. And before I get into this, I must mention that before this event, there was a black woman named Minnie Edmunds who had been brutally murdered in an alleyway, had her jugular slit, and was sexually assaulted. Now, because of the details of her murder, police believed that they were possibly looking for the same man who had murdered Janice Wylie and Emily Hoffert, because she was sexually assaulted and her jugular was slit. If that rings a bell a bit, this is why they connected it to those murders, is because Emily's jugular was slit and Janice Wylie was sexually assaulted. So they really thought, okay, if we find Minnie Edmunds' killer, we find the same killer that took the lives of those two women, and we win this case. Okay, sorry, about halfway through I realized like my lighting is fucking dying in the middle of this video, so we're just gonna have to roll with it. I tried to fix it the best way I could. Welcome to my pasty ass motherfucking face. Let's continue. Frank Isolda was a patrolman who was doing like his nightly rounds, and as he was like patrolling in the area that Minnie Edmunds had been murdered, there was this woman in an alleyway who was like screaming for help. And as Frank Isolda had run from his car into the alleyway, he noticed that she was being assaulted by a man who pinned her against the alleyway wall. When he had called to the man to leave the woman alone or to freeze, the man had left her alone, ran away, and Frank Isolda like attempted to shoot after him, but of course like he wasn't able to from a distance. So the man ended up getting away. He ended up going to the woman who identified herself as Elba Barrera. Elba had mentioned that she was able to rip a button off of the man's coat that was attacking her, and Frank Isolda had bagged it as evidence and asked her to come to the police department with him. When Frank Isolda got there, he asked her to file out a report, give her a description of the man, and Elba Barrera had told Frank that the man who had assaulted her was tall, slim, young black man. She said he was like early 20s, and that was the description that Frank walked away with, and he went back to do his nightly rounds. As he was doing his rounds, he went back to revisit the scene that Elba Barrera had been assaulted, and he noticed that this young gentleman was sitting underneath the doorway of a laundromat, and he was sitting there. Frank was doing his rounds. He had noticed that he had been sitting there for a while, and after like a good hour or so, like Frank had approached this man and asked him what he was doing. He said that he was just waiting for his brother. They were going to go do like work, like, you know, odd job work. And he was just waiting for his brother to pick him up and take him there. But I don't know exactly what happens here, but like Frank Isolda just says like, oh, you know what? You match the description that this like lady gave me. So I'm just going to like arrest you and like take you to the police department. Because you're tall, you're slim, and you're like early 20s black. So like I'm just going to, let's just go. Yeah, okay. So he fucking takes him to the police department. And as he gets there, like detectives tell Elba, like, we just brought this man in who like matches your description. He was hanging around the area where you were assaulted. So they take George, they put him in this room with a detective monitoring him. And on the door of that room is a peephole. And they ask Elba to peer into the room and basically identify this gentleman and say, is this the man that assaulted you? Elba pops into the peephole and she's like, well, can you have him like say things? Like, can you have him say like, I'm gonna rape you and I'm gonna kill you, etc. So the detective in the room asks him to say these things, and after he says them, Elba's like, that's the guy who assaulted me, like that's him right there. So the detectives, without a question, like arrest this guy. They throw him in an interrogation room and they start questioning him. This gentleman's name is George Whitmore. George Whitmore is a young teen who migrated from New Jersey to New York City in search of work so he could help his mom and his family out. He was waiting underneath that laundromat door to make extra side money with his brother, and his brother didn't find him there because the police brought him in simply because he was a young, tall, slim black man who matched the description, sure, but like they didn't bother asking him questions about his whereabouts or if anybody can confirm it, give him an alibi. They just fucking took him in and was like, yeah, that's the guy. And Elba over here, sure, she identified him, but we'll get into that later. So George Whitmore is sitting in this interrogation room and he's being asked questions like, you know, what was he doing, da-da-da-da, and I don't really think this detective had any true intentions, like positive intentions, because I think this was Joe DePrima, and we'll get into that. But first, I gotta say, as George Whitmore is in this interrogation room, guess who is in the lobby and notified that George Whitmore's things are in a box out in the lobby waiting for him? That's right, Eddie Bolger. So the detective goes up to Eddie Bolger, who's been kicked off of this case, mind you, for being a racist piece of shit, and he goes, oh, this is George Whitmore's things, like, in that box, like, that's his stuff. And so Eddie Bolger's like, oh, thanks, okay, yeah, shoo. And he walks over to George Whitmore's things, he takes the box, brings it to his desk, and he starts rummaging through his possessions, like, without his permission. I don't know if they do. I would assume so, because that's his things. And he goes through his wallet, and he particularly finds a photo of who looks to be like Janice Wylie. After finding that photo, Eddie Bolger then interrupts the interview Joe DePrima is doing with George Whitmore, tells him that he wants to talk to him, and tells him about this newfound evidence that he found. So they start interrogating George Whitmore. Now, they're talking to him, and they're asking him questions, and they're like, who is this woman? I found this in your wallet. Who is this woman? She's a blonde Caucasian woman, and she looks like Janice Wylie. Or I don't think he tells him that, but she looks like a murder victim, you know? And he says, I actually don't know who that woman is. I found this photo in a junkyard. Now, mind you, George Whitmore's father actually owns a junkyard, so it was very, like, it's not, like, abnormal or weird for him to be able to get his hands on possessions that people threw away. Like, his father actually owns a junkyard, which is how he was able to get this photo. So he tells detectives, like, I don't know who this lady is. I actually found this in a junkyard. And they were like, okay, well, why do you keep it? And he said, I keep it because I use it to brag to my friends that I have white girlfriends. You know, like, oh, I have these ladies and they're white, you know, because back then segregation, black and white, like that was like, I guess, like a big thing to brag about. Like, oh yeah, well, I have white girlfriends. Anyways, being a piece of shit and a racist, Eddie Bolger did not believe George Whitmore, and neither did Joe DePrima. He was like going along with Eddie, basically letting him lead the way. So, they start interrogating him. They're like, we don't believe you. And it gets to the point where it is reported that Eddie Bolger and Joe DePrima both physically assaulted George Whitmore. It was said that they slammed him into the wall, they hit his shoulders, they would kick his legs, and they would basically beat him into submission. They would want him to be the guy that they needed him to be, which was the murder of Minnie Edmunds, Janice Wylie, and Emily Hoffert. Even though this kid was completely innocent. Like, sorry to a little spoiler there, but the thing is that they interrogated him for 17 hours. 17 hours of this kid getting physically hurt, sitting there, enduring verbal abuse as well. The cops were basically feeding him details of the crimes, telling him, you did it, didn't you? Like stuff like that. And it got to the point where little by little, George couldn't help but end up conforming because he was sitting there for so long. He's like, I just want to get out of here. He's like, this is torture. I want to just escape these men. They're hurting me, and it's apparent that they're not going to let me go until I start saying what they want me to say. So they give him the statement papers, and they end up feeding him details of the case. They end up manipulating him, you know. They end up putting the details of the case in his head and having him put it out in his own words. And so he ends up writing a 61-page confession of the murders of Janice Wylie and Emily Hoffert and Minnie Edmunds. And it's details that only the detectives would know at this point. It's nothing new. It's nothing that the killer would know. It's just a reiterated form of what the detectives know, and they tell him to write that down. It gets to a point where, like, they're in there for so long that the media starts getting word from people within the police department, like, yeah, I think we got our guy. They've been in there for so long. I'm pretty sure they're, like, cracking the case, and it's, like, taking forever because they're, like, getting all the gruesome details and shit. So word gets out to the media and the public that they found the man who murdered Janice Wylie, Emily Hoffert, and Minnie Edmunds. You know, all of these crimes that this guy actually didn't commit. Like, they're out here like, oh my God, like, they found him, yes, you know, but no, not really, not at all. So, you know, it starts getting into the press, it starts getting into the public, like, they found the guy, like, this is it, this is George Whitmore. Meanwhile, George Whitmore is sitting in there on getting tortured, basically, to admit to something that he didn't do, because these detectives want to be the guys who solved it, who, like, got it, and, like, did it all, right? So, during, like, you know, the confession, they end up taking, like, a step outside, you know, they take a break. Like, God forbid, you know, all that hard torturing and conforming somebody into doing something they didn't do, right? With fear and tactics of that sort. They go outside, and their supervisor and the boss is basically like, listen, the photo of Janice Wylie is evidence, but I need George Whitmore to either recant that or confirm it. Like, this is your guys' job. Smooth it out and figure it out, right? So instead of doing the right thing and being like, oh, well, we don't really know if it's her, and like George says that he just got it from the junkyard, which his father owns a junkyard, and even though it's a possibility, instead of doing the right thing, they go back in there and they continue to torture this poor young man. They keep feeding him details of the crime. They're like, you did it, didn't you? You did it, George, didn't you? You went in there. And he's like, I got the photo from a junkyard. And they're like, no, George, you didn't. You went to this apartment on da-da-da street, you went up to the 3rd floor, you went to the apartment 3C specifically, and you went in there, you murdered these girls, you trashed their rooms, and you grabbed the photo from the table, didn't you, George, didn't you? Like, just feeding him this shit and expecting him to write it down. And because George was scared shitless, and because, and I quote, he claimed that Eddie Bolger had told him, write this down or I'll kick you in the balls. Because of things like that, George, like, wrote it down, you know? So he writes it down basically for the sake of his own life. And they changed the story to George not finding the photo in the junkyard, but in fact at the crime scene where the girls were murdered, the girls that he had murdered, and found it on the table and took it from there. After 17 hours of this shit, he turns in the confession and they arrest George Whitmore as the murderer of Minnie Edmunds, Janice Wylie, and Emily Hoffert. After this, the Brooklyn police are like celebrating, they're patting each other on the back, they're like, yeah, we fucking did it, we solved this shit. And there are still detectives who were like skeptical. They still had their suspicions, there was things that didn't add up, and there were even a few detectives who were working towards, you know, like freeing George Whitmore and clearing his name. So one of the detectives, I believe it was John Lynch, actually took the said photo of Janice Wylie that Eddie Bolger had claimed was her, and did the right thing and actually went to Mr. and Mrs. Wylie and was like, is this your daughter? He went to Patricia, is this Janice Wylie? He went to Susan Rothberg, a friend of them, said, is this Janice Wylie? Went to all sorts of family, all sorts of friends, is this photo of Janice Wylie? All of them said, no, this is not my daughter, this is not my friend, this is not my roommate. In fact, he was like widespread searching, like making sure this wasn't Janice Wylie, with more than a few people that, like, people outside of the situation, like in like the public, were like, you know, started identifying the picture of the woman as somebody who like lived in New Jersey, where like George Whitmore was from originally, and said that it was actually like another blonde woman that had lived near George's area. which again makes sense because the junkyard is in New Jersey and she threw that away and he kept it for bragging rights, and she lived out there. It wasn't Janice Wylie. People denied it was her, that the photo wasn't of her, yet Eddie Bolger was over here like, oh, she's blonde, she's Caucasian, it's Janice Wylie. This adds up. This is the perfect trap, so I can win and say that I solved this case, basically. And so after confirming that, there was then an investigative journalist by the name of I'm sorry if I'm saying this wrong, Slewin Rab. He actually went up to New Jersey and he traveled like 2 to 3 hours from New York so he could talk to people that George Whitmore had worked with. On August 26, 1963, I'm not sure if you guys are aware, but that is actually a very prominent day in history. That was the day that Martin Luther King Jr. had given his I Have a Dream speech in front of the Lincoln Memorial and led a march down that boulevard, you know, and it was his call to end racism in the United States. It was his call to gain civil and economic rights for black people around the world. It was a very prominent day. Black people and people all over the world were watching that on the news. They were seeing it go down. They were there themselves. They were in the march. They were a part of the movement. And George Whitmore, you know, had actually been proven and had people backing him up, saying like he was at work from almost 8 a.m. In the morning, like to sometime at work with his colleagues, like in the kitchen working, doing his job, and till 8 p.m. There was friends, there was colleagues, there was neighbors who claimed that they had seen him there that day. There was people claiming that they had seen him in the lobby of this hotel he was staying at, watching the TV, watching the march, listening to Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech from 8 a.m. to almost 8 p.m. in that day. He had people, this investigative journalist had identified people that could testify in court that George Whitmore was anywhere but at the crime scene. Literally. Anywhere but the crime scene. And again, remember, the crime scene was said to be, or the attacker was said to be in the apartment around, past 9:30 when the girls had left to some point, past or at 11 a.m. Because remember that disconnected radio clock? It stopped at what time? Good, you're listening. 10:37 a.m. It stopped at 10:37 a.m., which means the attacker was in the apartment before and after that time. How is George able to kill somebody if his colleagues, his entire workplace, can testify that he was there at 8 a.m. past that time? How can he be at the crime scene if neighbors and friends can claim to see him from after work to 8 p.m.? Hello. So they easily established his alibi, right? And you think it'd be over at that point. He walk a free man. His reputation is cleared, right? No, unfortunately. So Slewin Rab calls his lawyer and he's like, hey, I got these people here who are willing to testify in court that George Whitmore has been here since this time to this time in the day, and his friends and his neighbors and his mom. So there, boom, we have his alibi. Lawyer's like, great news. Let me inform the police, da-da-da. So police were like, yeah, sure, okay, you established an alibi. But because he was already heavily convicted of the murder and they had already set that initial narrative, they didn't say anything. They didn't tell the public hey, we got the wrong guy. George Whitmore's actually a good dude. He's innocent. They kept to themselves and they actually didn't say anything. So George Whitmore actually sat in prison with the whole world and the public and that community and the neighborhood and the victims, the families and friends thinking that he did it, that this guy killed Minnie Edmunds, Janice Wylie, and Emily Hoffert when he didn't. They stayed quiet. Why? Because pride and ego. Eddie Bolger and Joe DePrima and other people who were behind them didn't want to seem incompetent. They didn't want to seem like a failure for not finding the right guy. So they didn't do the right thing. Per usual. Why the fuck am I surprised? But they didn't do the right thing. So George Whitmore actually had those crimes on his reputation for almost a decade before he actually ended up, officially suing the state of New York City and winning a large sum of money, which was $500,000. He eventually cleared it off of his reputation and cleared his name, but it took him a decade because of these people. And, this is where we meet our end with George Whitmore. So I want to say, leave this guy on a happy note, that he did end up winning that $500,000 from the state of New York for wrongfully convicting him, and he passed away in a senior care in a senior care home at the age of 68, the year 2012. And he passed away and lived a happy life after that. But he had to put up with this bullshit, dude. Like, they even had to, Eddie Bolger, of course, was over here like, no, he did it. What about that 61-page confession? And I'm sure you're asking too, what about that 61-page confession? What about Elba Barrera identifying him? Well, here's the thing. Y'all remember that $10,000 reward that cost a lot of money back then? Yep. Turns out Elba Barrera most likely heard of this reward and was in it for the money. So she staged an assault in the alleyway and was brought into the police department and basically sat there until they brought somebody in matching her description, which was pretty fucking vague. So it could be anybody. And again, it, proven correct. Frank Isolda saw the first tall, slim, young black man and fucking brought him in, and she decided that the first man that they would bring in, she was going to say, yep, that's him. And there you have it. She didn't end up getting her money, at least I hope not, but it was said and rumored that she was in on getting the reward, and that the man who assaulted her was most likely in on it too. Staged act. Then let's go to the 61-page confession. So after the 61-page confession, Eddie Bolger, of course, like sticking to his fucking ego and pride, was like, yeah, well, what about the confession? And they were like, yeah, you're right, what about the confession? So they bring in a specialist who would do a one-on-one question and answer kind of thing with George Whitmore without the detectives present, without their aid of filling him in with the details, without the, guidance of his 61-page confession. He ended up asking George Whitmore questions pertaining to the crime scene and the victims. So they'd ask him questions like, oh, how many times, or like, where did you stab Janice Wylie? And he would say things like, oh, I stabbed her in the head and in the leg, when obviously she was stabbed in the chest and had her stomach disemboweled, right? And she was stabbed 7 times. Then they would ask him things like, okay, what was the color of the material that you used to tie up the girls? And he'd say like, oh, that it was like navy blue, when really it was like white, or it was like blue and green. So he would answer these questions like, and fail them, basically. Like, it had shown the specialist that this guy has no fucking idea what he's talking about, and he's pretty much guessing at this point. The specialist would declare that, like, George Whitmore did not commit these crimes, given the fact that he had no knowledge of the crimes. He did not know what he was talking about. And then Eddie Bolger, of course, was over here like, well, yeah, he's completely insane. That's why he's lying and saying he doesn't remember and da-da-da. So because Eddie Bolger and, like, the detectives that were backing him and Joe DePrima, like, made these claims, George Whitmore had to undergo a psych test, which he came out passing with flying colors, and they declared him sane. After this, Eddie Bolger, like, literally had nothing, like, no more to say. They were just like, bruh, you're salty that you got this wrong. You're fucking upset that you're being blamed now that you have targeted the wrong guy, convicted the wrong guy, and had him arrested. Like, let it go, dude. Let it go. So after this whole fiasco, like, police continued to look for the killer, but they had no luck. It wasn't until, like, years later, like a few years later, that the police had an actual solid lead. And what ended up going on with this, it was that they had taken in a man by the name of Nathan Delaney and like they arrested him for like murder. Like Nathan Delaney had like apparently like stabbed a man in the head over like a drug dispute of some sort. So as this guy was like handcuffed in the back of a paddy wagon, like 60s old like kind of truck police car, he was sitting there with a policeman who was like monitoring him, and he had said like, listen, I know the person who had actually killed those girls, Janice Wylie and Emily Hoffert, but I'm not talking until I have like a deal cut out for me. And because like he was like pretty like, I don't know, like when a person says like, I want a deal cut out for me, or I'm not giving out information, usually they have some pretty solid information. Like usually they're serious about this. So the policeman had like told the driver to like take him back to the police department, and they talked to John Lynch and detectives who had been on this case and were trusted, not people like Eddie Bolger and so on. And I'm pretty sure after that, Eddie Bolger must have been like suspended or definitely kicked out, because he convicted the wrong guy and like created all that fiasco for the police of Manhattan and Brooklyn. So they're talking to Nathan Delaney and they're like, look, what do you got for us? Like, we'll give you the deal, but tell us what you know. If your information isn't reliable, like, we're not going to give you the deal. So Nathan Delaney tells them that on August 26, 1963, he and his wife were like in their apartment one day, and in come barging is his friend. So his friend was said to be like really frantic, out of it, just like super like crazy, and he had blood on him, and he was like asking all these questions about like murder. He's like, I just iced these two dames, and he's like, can police trace semen in a girl's body? And Nathan was like, no, but like, what did you do? And his friend had told him what he did. Now, after explaining like what happened, like, you know, he helped his friend like clean up, and so you know, saw him on his way home. The police had asked for a name, and Nathan Delaney had said that his friend's name was Ricky Robles. Ricky Robles was like a very mid-20s, early 20s guy. He was known for burglary, drug addiction, drug possession, drug dealing, all sorts of stuff like that. He was known to have like 2 accounts of assault, hurting people as he was like robbing them and stuff like that. And the police right away, after the mention of this guy, like arrested him. They brought him into the department, the interrogation rooms. They had Nathan Delaney there. Nathan, you know, they were talking with Ricky and Nathan, and like Nathan like repeated the story, but of course Ricky had denied any involvement, any responsibility having to do with the murders. And so because he had denied anything and there wasn't really anything solid to go off of but Nathan's testimony, they had to let Ricky go. And it actually wasn't until like 2-3 years later that they had finally got this guy for what he did. And it's actually weird because detectives were like, Ricky Robles, that sounds familiar, like we actually know this guy. And it turns out that early on in the investigation, when they were doing their comb through with the apartments, they'd actually come across Ricky Robles because of his background, but he had a solid alibi from his mother and her friend, who had said that they had him at the apartment all day cleaning, redecorating, you know, moving stuff around, and that he had been there all day and there was no possibility that he had committed the crime. So, you know, they actually, in order to get this guy, they actually, you know, ended up bugging Nathan Delaney's house. You know, they put wires everywhere and listening equipment that would allow them to listen in on conversations in real time and record it. On January 14th, 1965, Ricky had come around, or like they had bugged the place, and Ricky had come to Nathan's at 11:55 p.m. and Nathan was talking to Ricky, like trying to get him to like confess to the murders, open up about what he did. And he wasn't very open about it, but he did kind of dabble in the topic before saying a phrase that police would be able to use against him in court, and it actually helped them get him arrested. So Ricky had said to Nathan, after mentioning Emily Hoffert's glasses and the placement of the crime scene that only the killer would know, he had said, if I could only plant it in my mind that you made this up and it didn't really happen, like I would take that test. Ricky Robles was referring to a lie detector test that police had suggested, but he denied because he knew he was guilty. And right there, he's basically saying, like, if I hadn't done this, I would be able to take the test with a free conscience of, what is the word I'm looking for? Of guilt. A guilty free conscience. I would be able to take this test and pass it with flying colors, but because I did something, I can't, because I will fail it and they will know the truth. After this, police had taken that recording to a judge who had ordered his arrest about 2 days later. They took him in, they, you know, ignored his request for his lawyer. They showed him the wires at Nathan's house. They showed him like, dude, we got you on recording, we bugged this house, we've got your confession, we're going to take you in for an interrogation and interview. And he was like, I would like my lawyer. And they ignored these requests. They ignored it because they wanted Ricky to confess on his own, and they didn't want the lawyer to come in and like shut him up. So basically they outwaited and they waited and they urged him to confess. And because Ricky was like a drug addict, he actually during this time had some issues with withdrawal symptoms, like he was throwing up, he was sweating a lot, he was pale, and he was like begging for his lawyer, but they ignored him. And eventually, before his lawyer even got there, they actually were able to get him to confess, and they had learned things that only the killer would know, and that happened to be Ricky Robles. Ricky had said that he had actually climbed into the apartment building, and police were actually quite surprised because this was like a 40-foot drop, you know, to the 3rd floor, but he had said that he saw the window open to the apartment on the 3rd floor, and he had decided to climb up the wall using some of the fire escape and climb into the window. When he got there, he had saw that Janice was nude. She had just gotten out of the shower, and he decided he wanted to have sex with her. He then tied her up and rummaged through Emily's room while Janice was bound in the other room. He had already decided that he was going to let Janice live. He had no intentions on killing her at the beginning. But then as he was about to leave the apartment, in walked Emily, who saw the crazy scene. He then moved to the kitchen in a rush, grabbed a kitchen knife, and used it to stab Emily in the back, who had turned around to escape. The blade broke in her back, and he grabbed her, preventing her from leaving the apartment. He took Emily, threw her into Janice's bedroom, where he bound two women together by the forearm and wrist. He then was about to leave until Emily had said, "I will remember your face, and I will turn you in to the police." At that moment, Ricky Robles had chosen to kill both women. He had stabbed Janice 7 times in the chest and then slit open her stomach. He then slit Emily's jugular. After that, he had then left the apartment by the kitchen service door and went to his friend Nathan Delaney's house to hide. Police were baffled, but they had a sense of accomplishment, not that they had found and convicted the right man for the crime, but because it was finally over. Like, they got this guy, they got his confession, and now, you know, his lawyer showed up, but he was too late. They had his confession, and they were able to take him to court and convict him of the murders that he committed. And even though he hadn't murdered Minnie Edmunds, that was still an ongoing case. They had the murder of Emily Hoffert and Janice Wylie, and he was sentenced to prison for 25 years to life, basically. And, sorry, I had to look at my notes at the end there just to make sure I had the details correct, but that's the story of how Janice Wylie and Emily Hoffert were murdered, and yeah, it's pretty unfortunate, pretty big wild goose chase there. Before you guys go, I wanted to share some information with you that I kind of found really interesting, and it was tied to this case. So you guys remember Slewin' Rab, the investigative journalist? Well, he was a very big deal. He's a very prominent person because he not only helped solve some other murders that were just as troubling and challenging, but because he had established George Whitmore's alibi and, you know, made him an innocent man, he was very prominent. And they actually made, I wanted to share with you guys, they actually made what is it called? They actually made a movie of Slewin' Rab, but they turned it into instead of a nerdy guy at his desk who is an investigative journalist, they made this really badass action-packed detective named Kojak, and they actually made a television series about this guy, or sorry, a movie at first, and then it was turned into a television series because it was so popular upon its release. And it went on for about 5 years. It starred actor Telly Savalas, I'm sorry if I'm saying that incorrectly, and it was a movie. The movie was called The Marcus Nelson Murders, which won an Emmy Awards in 1973, actually. And it went on for 5 years before it ended, and it was pretty cool. The first episode of the television series was actually a reenactment of the Career Girls murder of Janice Wylie and Emily Hoffert. And I actually found the first episode on YouTube, and I thought maybe we could watch it together and I could share it with you guys. Because, you know, since it took place back then, in the 60s or around there, of course, things that you watch that were made way back then can be a little cringy. So what happened to them was unfortunate, but I think the way that they reenacted this episode was really funny, and it was kind of sad at the same time because it's they make it so dramatic, you know, these girls actually try to fight back for their life, and they make them seem so feeble, female that can't do it, you know. So here we go.
What you are about to see is a dramatization of one of the most controversial and bitterly debated police investigations preceding the Supreme Court's landmark Miranda decision of 1966. Name changes, compressions of time, and composites of certain characters have been made in order to present this most significant story.
I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have
Melissa?
a dream that my
Kathy, is that
land where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
How did you get in?
The hero of today's events is clearly Martin Luther King, who emerges as one of the most appealing, magnetic personalities in our country today. That is clear in the faces and the attitudes of the crowds here. What the tangible effects of today's events will be on the vast American public has yet to be seen. No one really knows the heart of America. Whether all the years of hatred and racial violence are a thing of the past.
Hello?
Whether we have now turned a corner.
Are you? Oh, I'm sorry. What's going on here? I see what's going on here. Kathy, don't do anything and he won't hurt you. Don't touch me. Leave me alone. Give me my glasses. I want to see you. I want to see what you look like. Don't touch me. Don't touch me. Ah! Joanne? Is anybody home? Jerry? Could you come?
Another piece of information that I wanted to share, and it's sad news, it's not as lighthearted as the Kojak television series, but 12 years after the passing of his daughter, Max Wylie had committed suicide. He had shot himself in the head in a hotel room after calling the front desk and telling them that he would need an ambulance because he was having a heart attack. When the ambulance and paramedics had gotten there and they went into the room, they had found him sprawled on his bed with the gun near his hand, and he had left a note. I'm not sure if it was a suicide note, but it was said that he had left a note for his wife, and it was pertaining to his real estate representatives and his lawyer. I read a lot about how police weren't very surprised by this because Max Wylie had seemed very distant, grieving, and just so disoriented when he had first discovered his own daughter's lifeless body in her bedroom, which I can understand that must be very scarring, and it's probably something that he's never been able to make peace with or forget, and I feel like that heavily influenced his decision to commit suicide. That is all for this case today. Thank you so much for joining me and hanging out with me today. I appreciate you, and I will see you in the next one. Stay safe. Have a great day.